Ready to hear from the legendary columnist for the New York Post, Mr. Phil Mushnick, as well as the legendary journalist, Dave Meltzer. And you're bringing these two guys on the show simultaneously, John. What was the thought behind that?
Well, Dave was probably the most educated person there was in regard to the story when it comes to all the nuances, and his education, his knowledge about what was going on, and his constant communication with people who will not be named, his sources, and he and Phil were talking. So I figured it would be beneficial for the listeners and even for myself to bring both of these gentlemen on together.
Okay. So without further ado, let's get to the meat of a very serious story.
Gentlemen, are you there?
Yes, Mushnick's here. I'm here.
Okay, we're on the phone with Phil Mushnick from the New York Post and Dave Meltzer from the Wrestling Observer newsletter. Now, Phil, you have been instrumental as far as in the mainstream media of covering this story, following it from the Zaharian trial, leading up to the events of this past week, last week's Inside Edition piece. You're about one of the only mainstream media figures to follow this as closely as anyone in the business has.
Yeah, that's disappointing to me personally. However, wrestling doesn't fit comfortably in any niche as it relates to newspapers. It's neither fish nor fowl. And even in good economic times, I think the underbelly, the evil underbelly of professional wrestling would escape a critical overview. However, the situation is exacerbated in a recession, during which time we see local newspapers unable to staff NHL games on the road. The Islanders and Devils, for the most part, aren't staffed on the road by the New York Post or the Daily News. So it's not as if we can reasonably expect investigative journalists to go out and do a whole big investigation on professional wrestling. And it just strikes me as something that people my age, I'm 39, when we grew up and we watched wrestling, it was, as Bruno Sammartino says, it was harmless. Wrestling had its critics, but it was harmless. It never did anything or never facilitated anything that would hurt any kid anywhere. But just to look at it, prima facie, on the surface, to see the enormity of these people and the unnatural builds on these people, you know that this something is far more than playful harmlessness. This stuff is brutal.
Yeah, it's been a heavy story. One thing that I've been really upset over the last week and a half, just having to keep bringing up this topic. And Dave is another person who's covered pro wrestling. I'm sure that it's something that you go back and forth on. It's beyond the point now. You have to report on it. The story won't go away. As a journalist covering wrestling, as in-depth the way you do, how does the story, how has it made you feel about covering pro wrestling?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that it is kind of like forced the promotions into, even heavier deception than they're normally used to. And I guess that kind of, as far as like watching pro wrestling, being a fan of pro wrestling, I can't say that as a whole, I mean, there are promotions that the steroid problem, I mean, there might be steroids there, but they're not rewarding people based on physique. There are promotions like that. And I still enjoy watching pro wrestling. I enjoy it more than ever, really. At some point, something, I'm just hoping, you've got to spread honesty, and at some point, I mean, I don't know how long they can go with the deception, but as long as they go with the deception, I guess that we have to keep talking about it. And I unfortunately think that's going to be a long time.
Well, with all the mainstream coverage now that's happening regarding this story, Titan Sports should make some type of statement. I know the only person that I have spoken to that has talked to anyone within the office was Steve Beverly of MatWatch. He did speak to Steve Planamenta briefly on Friday, who discussed it, but they didn't address the reason that all this is coming out is because of the Arsenio Hall show, first of all, and Hulk Hogan claiming that he only used the steroids for medical purposes back in 1983.
John, it would seem to me that in the throes of the Zahorian trial, the World Wrestling Federation had the opportunity to come clean, to say, yes, this was then, and by then I mean last year or a few months ago, and this is now. We confess to the error of our ways. What we did was wrong. In fact, it was horribly wrong, and we'll never do it again. Instead, the first statement that came out of the WWF was that this trial had absolutely nothing to do with the WWF, and for anyone to suggest something like that would be ludicrous. At that point, you know where these people's hearts are. They're in syringes.
Yeah, I hate.
Well, there's another point that needs to be made that I don't think a lot of people are aware of, and that is that the WWF had more lead time on this than anyone realizes, because they knew back in 1989 Zahorian was being investigated. In the Zahorian trial, Zahorian himself testified that in '89, which was months before Zahorian was ever busted, and 2 years, approximately, almost 2 years before the trial, Zahorian testified. Pat Patterson called him up and said, "Hey, there's heat. Make sure to supposedly, be ready for something." So, I mean, they knew in '89 that there was heat, that there was investigations, and Billy Graham has spoke about, the people on the New Jersey, the Highway Patrol in New Jersey knew that the guys were carrying drugs, and the guys would avoid going from New York to Philadelphia on the Jersey Turnpike because they wanted to avoid those highway patrolmen who knew that the wrestlers were carrying stuff going from place to place. They were told to avoid that. So this is not something that is just, a lot of people think, well, it's just come up. They've had maybe 6 months isn't enough time to do something. The fact is that they've, they knew about it. And Vince Jr., and everyone in the WWF knew about the steroid use in the WWF. They knew Zahorian. Zahorian's name was no secret to people as far as that stuff goes. I mean, I knew about Zahorian in the early 80s, and everyone in wrestling did. So,
and I think if any of us could be reasonably assured that this is a minor problem, that this exists on, say, a 5% level or 10% level, I think we'd be inclined to give them the benefit of the doubt. However, everyone who comes forward now is talking about it.
And John will remember this. We were at the press conference or at a press meeting with Vince in August, and Vince told us to our face that nobody on that promotion was on steroids. This was in August. And it's laughable. And, you can look at the guys, and you can see that. So, I mean, that's a little bit more deception. If he could get the steroid problem under control, and these guys, a lot of these guys are psychologically addicted, and these guys really want to be big. And I would be, more than acceptable if steroids were not used as a rewarding tool, or the enormous physiques were not a reward, that we're not being rewarded by better contracts, better spots in the promotion, and
that's the core of the problem. That's the core of the problem. This is an industry...
That's not being addressed. I mean, just recently, Vince brought in Chris Chavis, Chris Walker, and I have nothing against the two guys, but he's bringing in guys... He's not bringing in guys of a different look. He's bringing in guys with the same look, and then he's trying to say that things have changed, or that things were never even like this, and that's just not so.
It was not so. And I'll tell you what, wouldn't a little contriteness on the part of WWF gone a long way at that point?
It would have gone a heck of a long way.
Yeah.
I mean, they could have avoided most of this stuff.
All of it.
I know. And that's why I was happy that Dave and Phil were on together, because Dave had all those facts. He, just the stuff about them knowing that there was an investigation on Zahorian in 1989. So they had plenty of time to clean this up and to make it right. And Hogan, if he would have went on Arsenio and say, "Hey man, I made I am sorry. This is what I did and I apologize." But none of that happened. And that's why this broadcast from January 12th, 1991 was still covering this story. Would not go away because of the way they handled it and because of their PR efforts and the way they handled it all.
Then more and more came out, which led to another trial, which led to other scandals, which led to various things. And you're right, everything just snowballed. It got bigger and bigger and bigger, John.
Yeah, it just wouldn't go away. And then, like you said, other scandals spun off of it. Yeah,
it was almost like flavor of the week. Every week you'd hear something new about some other topic, and it was all coming from that company, and it was just so chaotic and, ugly, really.
Yeah, and it was very stressful.
It really was.
Sit in the seat as we were doing each week to cover it all.
And for anybody who loved wrestling, you wanted to cover wrestling. You would. I'm sure you would have preferred at that point to sit down with your guests and talk about a great match you had just seen, or an
Yes.
excellent pay-per-view card, or an up-and-coming star. But you didn't have time for that because this was the 800-pound gorilla in the room. You couldn't ignore it.
Yeah, and I had a lot of people pointing, you know, why don't you just get off of it? Why don't you stop it already? This is a vendetta. You know, you're doing this. I mean, but it wasn't the case. But that's the things that I was told back then. I must have had some type of vendetta because I kept covering it and covering it and covering it, and you know, each time I covered it, it put me in deeper hot water. From out there in Connecticut. I mean, they just hated the fact that I was on the air each week now at a big, huge station talking about this stuff and bringing on guys like Phil Mushnick.
Well, I don't understand the logic of accusing someone who's trying to make a living in pro wrestling, trying to rip it apart, because you were trying to rip it apart. You were trying to get to the bottom of something and maybe help solve the problem. I think that's where your heart was. Yeah, it was.
Yeah, and one thing stands in my head, and we'll cover this in the future too, is when Vince Russo met Vince McMahon for the first time, and McMahon told him, "You guys don't understand how much fun doing a radio show could be."
No, but
this was not fun.
No. Hey, you know what? It wasn't fun in my office either. You know, I'm sitting around. We were doing our weekly newsletter at that point too. And I wrote most of that, and it was like, is this the business I want to cover anymore? Yeah, seriously, I had second thoughts. I was like, are these the people I want to be associated with? Is this as good as it gets? This was the biggest, most famous company, and this is the best they can do? And plus, on top of it, the product was very much unlike the stuff I grew up watching. Mm-hmm. So I thought it was lesser. I didn't think it was as entertaining, and I thought it was so calculated towards young people, you know, and kids, that I started to lose my fandom, and it hurt.
Yeah.
Because I didn't want to lose my fandom, but they were taking away what I had enjoyed for so long.